What's more dangerous, a runaway government or a runaway court of public opinion? It's a lot easier to put guardrails on government than it is to place guardrails on society at large. And part of this is on purpose. The whole idea of limited government, and specifically of a limited federal government, is that the social institutions and, to a more limited degree, state and local government institutions will step in and act as regulatory bodies on society. But while government can easily run afoul of individual sovereignty and human rights, so too can society at large. And ideally, the invisible hand of the market is at play in the regulation of society. Certain values are promoted through action and they rise to the front of society as a result. But in a functioning and a free society, there's still room for dissent. So, for instance, you might fundamentally disagree with your neighbor, the dairy farmer, and you might take your business elsewhere because you don't want to support his values by purchasing his product, which are effectively an extension of himself. But this mode of being allows for you to seek out and promote the values you agree with and still leaves him the freedom to do the same. There is no activism in this kind of behavior, and that's a very different thing than what we have nowadays, which is a sort of kangaroo court of public opinion, and the idea that in the name of the common good, it's all right to run out of business anyone who dissents from what is the social consensus as to what is good or what's not. So the possibility of dissent has become increasingly more difficult. And the problem with this is not only that it makes rights of conscience more difficult to hold and makes egalitarianism more difficult, and of course makes the idea of individual sovereignty much more impossible and much more of a romantic dream than an actuality. But because social institutions have such a primacy in the fabric of America, they're a lot more difficult to rein in than is government when it goes off the rails. And this becomes particularly dangerous when, as is the case these days, government also has expanded itself beyond its purview. And not only is this the case in federal government at large, but particularly in the executive, which is problematic because it's one man. It's not a large body composed of entities with competing ideas and value sets who are then vying for supremacy and vying to get legislation rooted on their idea of what the good is passed. Instead, you have an enervated singular will of society at large and an enervated singular will in the presidency. And when you marry these together, you get rid of the wall between government and the private sphere and instead unite them. And this is particularly problematic when both are interested in social activism, because a social activist government is not ideal because true egalitarianism is impossible because there's a hierarchy of need which is promoted, and since government is not a creator, since its resources come from its citizens, this means that what is being promoted by one group is coming at the expense of another group. So it's difficult for individual sovereignty and true parity of rights to exist. But the comfort of a limited government is the knowledge that, well, at least there are only a couple areas where government can do this. But when you marry government to social thought and to social activism, this no longer becomes the case. There is no escape for those who dissent. And this is particularly troubling not only in that it eradicates the rights of conscience, but it really makes individual sovereignty nearly impossible to attain at the same time.